The Blue Ridge Mountains are breathtaking in daylight, rolling ridges painted with mist and sunlight. But when darkness falls, the same slopes and valleys transform into something altogether different. What feels serene by day becomes oppressive at night, a place where every sound is amplified and every shadow seems to move. And it was in this wilderness, at the edge of a forgotten trail, that the story of the vanished camper began. His name was never printed in newspapers, though park rangers remember him well. A lone traveler, experienced with the outdoors, he was last seen hiking into the mountains with a large pack and a calm smile, determined to spend a weekend away from civilization. He had chosen an isolated clearing, far from the established campsites, a place where the trees grew thick and the ground was littered with moss and stone. When rangers found the site weeks later, what they uncovered unsettled even the most hardened among them. The tent still stood, zipped neatly as if waiting for its occupant. The fire pit held ashes, faintly damp from recent rain, though no new wood had been added since that last night. Cooking utensils were laid out carefully, a pan perched on a rock as if it had been left mid-use. Nothing had been scattered, nothing rifled through. Bears had not disturbed it, nor had the winds. The site was frozen in eerie stillness. But the most chilling discovery was what lay just outside the ring of the firelight. Dozens of footprints pressed into the soil, circling the tent. They were barefoot, human-like, yet twisted, arches flattened, toes elongated, heels dragging through the mud. They surrounded the campsite entirely, looping again and again, sometimes doubling over themselves as though more than one figure had joined the procession. It was as though something had waited at the edge of the light, circling him, watching. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, nothing to suggest a violent end. And yet, the camper was gone. His pack remained inside the tent, untouched. His torch lay beside the fire pit. Even his boots sat neatly beside his sleeping bag, as though he had been preparing for rest. Whatever had come for him, it had taken him barefoot into the woods, leaving nothing but the haunting ring of distorted tracks. The rangers marked the incident quietly, writing it off as another disappearance in a forest known for swallowing those who strayed too far. But some of them whispered among themselves, sharing what they had heard in the darkness on their own lonely patrols. The rustling of leaves without wind, the soft padding of bare feet along the trails, the sensation of being watched from just beyond the trees. The Blue Ridge held many secrets, but this was the first true warning. The feral ones were real, and they were watching. And the vanished camper's last campsite was not just a mystery. It was a message. Those who live near the Blue Ridge know better than to wander too far from the trails after sunset. The woods there have a way of swallowing light, drinking it until even the strongest torch barely cuts a circle through the suffocating blackness. And it is within that darkness, at the shifting line where tree trunks become walls of shadow, that many hikers have spoken of the same horrifying sight, eyes watching. One such account came from a pair of friends who had set out for a weekend of camping near an old fire road. They were not inexperienced. Both had hunted, both had slept under the stars, and neither frightened easily. But what they witnessed on their second night in those woods broke something inside them that no retelling could ever mend. The night had been unnervingly still. No owls, no coyotes, no crickets. Just silence so complete it felt as though the forest itself were holding its breath. The men sat by the fire, exchanging nervous jokes to mask their unease, when one of them noticed a glint between the trees. At first he thought it the reflection of flame on wet leaves, but when the light flickered again, his blood ran cold. Two eyes, set low to the ground, stared back at him from the darkness. They were too far apart to belong to a deer, too wide, too deliberate in their gaze. He pointed it out to his friend, and soon both men were watching, breath shallow, as the eyes blinked. The motion was not like an animal's quick flicker. It was slow, purposeful, and horribly human. Then more appeared. One pair became three, then five, scattered along the timberline, always just beyond the glow of the fire. They did not move closer, nor did they retreat. They only watched. The men whispered urgently, debating whether to shine their torches toward the shapes. but some instinct warned against it. The eyes blinked in unison, as though sharing one mind, one intention. Hours passed like that, the fire crackling low, the men trapped in a silence broken only by their own ragged breathing. The eyes never left. At times they shifted positions, a set vanishing from one tree line only to appear again at another angle, as though circling, testing the boundaries of courage. Just before dawn, when the fire had nearly died to ash, the eyes finally withdrew. Not all at once, but slowly, blinking out in pairs until the forest appeared empty again. The men dared not speak until the sun's first light spilled across the ridge, and when it did, they saw what the firelight had hidden. The soil around their campsite was a chaos of prints. Bare, twisted feet pressing deep into the mud, overlapping each other in a circle around the fire pit. The creatures had been closer than they realized. Neither man ever camped in the Blue Ridge again. When pressed, they would say only one thing. The eyes in the trees were not animals and they were not people. They were something else. Something that had waited for centuries in the shadows, watching, choosing. And once you've seen them, you never walk the woods without feeling their gaze again. There are caves scattered across the Blue Ridge, hollows carved by water and time, places where the earth swallows light and sound. For hikers, they are curiosities, shelter from sudden storms, places to test courage by stepping inside. But some caves are better left untouched, because not all of them are empty. One story often whispered among rangers concerns a small party of explorers who had been mapping off-trail caves for sport. They were experienced, carrying ropes, helmets, and lanterns, confident in their abilities. By late afternoon, they discovered a narrow opening in the rock face, almost hidden by brush. It seemed insignificant at first, but curiosity drew them inside. The cave was tight, its walls slick with moisture, the air stale and cool. They expected it to run shallow, but instead it twisted deeper, branching like the veins of the earth. Their lanterns illuminated strange marks along the walls, not natural striations, but deliberate etchings. Crude lines, handprints, shapes that suggested figures bent low to the ground. As they pressed further, the atmosphere grew suffocating. The air seemed to vibrate with an unseen hum, a low thrum that echoed in their chests. One of them joked that it was just the earth settling, though his voice trembled. Still, they kept going until the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. That was when the smell hit them, rank, metallic, and unmistakably organic. The floor was littered with bones, not scattered as though by animals, but arranged in piles, stacked neatly, almost reverently. Deer, raccoon, bird, and among them bones that were unmistakably human. Femurs, rib cages, a half-buried skull whose empty sockets seemed to stare at the intruders. Panic clawed at them, and they debated fleeing immediately. But before they could retreat, one of their lanterns flickered across the far wall. In the shadows, hunched shapes shifted. Dozens of them. At first, the explorers thought they were rock formations. But then the shapes unfolded. Long arms, crooked backs, pale eyes reflecting the lantern light. The feral ones had been there all along, silent, crouched, watching. Their movements were slow, almost curious, as though surprised to see strangers enter their domain. But curiosity quickly turned to something darker. The figures crept forward, limbs scraping against the stone, nails clicking against rock. The explorers bolted, scrambling back through the narrow tunnels, lantern light swinging wildly. Behind them came the sound of pursuit, bare feet slapping against stone, guttural breaths echoing off the walls. One man swore he felt fingers brush his ankle as he crawled through the final narrow passage. When they finally burst back into the daylight, gasping, bruised, and terrified, the cave was silent again. No pursuit. No sound but the wind in the trees. They collapsed in relief, yet when they dared to look back, something had changed. The cave's entrance was gone, hidden once more beneath brush and rock, as if the earth itself had sealed it. Only one of the party ever spoke of what they saw. His words were simple but chilling. The cave wasn't empty, and it was never meant for us. The others never returned to the mountains. But locals still whisper that if you listen closely in the Blue Ridge at night, sometimes you'll hear it. The hollow echo of nails clicking against stone, waiting for the next fool to stumble into the dark. The Blue Ridge has a way of magnifying silence. In those mountains, the night is so heavy that even the faintest sound becomes sharp, undeniable. Campers learn quickly that every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, carries meaning. But sometimes the noises are not of animals at all. Sometimes they are voices. A young couple discovered this on a late autumn camping trip. They had chosen a small clearing just off a trail, ringed by tall pines that swayed gently in the wind. At first, everything was perfect. The fire crackled warmly, the air was crisp, and the stars glimmered above. But when night deepened, unease began to creep in. It started with faint murmurs, drifting on the wind. At first, they dismissed it as the sound of other hikers, perhaps a group camped deeper in the woods. But the whispers came from every direction, moving from one side of the clearing to the other, rising and falling as though circling them. The couple strained to hear, but the words were muffled, garbled, as though spoken from underwater. Then the tone shifted. The voices grew sharper, clearer. They began to hear their names. First hers, then his, carried softly through the trees. The woman laughed nervously, insisting it was a trick of the mind. Yet her hands trembled as she gripped her partner's arm. The man shouted into the night, demanding whoever it was to come forward. The forest answered only with silence. Moments later, the whispers returned, closer this time, heavy with mockery. The names were spoken again, but in a cadence that felt wrong, stretched, distorted, as though mouths unused to speech were practicing the sounds. The woman swore she saw movement at the tree line, pale shapes slipping between the trunks. But when the torchlight swept across the forest, nothing was there. The fire burned lower, its circle of safety shrinking, and the voices pressed in tighter. Whispers became giggles, soft and cruel, echoing through the clearing. The couple decided to abandon camp, stuffing their belongings haphazardly into bags. But the voices only followed. Every step down the trail was shadowed by the hiss of unseen mouths repeating their names, closer, always closer. When they finally stumbled onto the main path, their torches revealed something that turned their fear into dread. Dozens of footprints trailed alongside their own, bare, wide, twisted, pressed deep into the soil as though something had walked just beyond the light, keeping pace with them all along. The couple never camped in the Blue Ridge again. They told their story only once, to a ranger who warned them never to stray from the main trails again. And though the ranger did not say it outright, his eyes betrayed the truth. He had heard the voices too. For those who know the mountains, the lesson is clear. If the forest begins to whisper your name, do not listen. Do not answer. For the feral ones speak in stolen tongues, and they are always searching for new names to learn. There are moments in the forest when daylight begins to collapse into shadow, and everything feels uncertain. The trees stretch taller, the air grows colder, and paths that seemed welcoming hours earlier now twist into threatening corridors. It was during this hour, dusk, that a lone hiker vanished, his story passed down by those who later pieced together the fragments of what happened. He had set out in the morning with a rucksack, camera, and journal, determined to capture the wild beauty of the Blue Ridge in autumn. For most of the day, his notes recorded simple observations: bird calls, colors of leaves, the distant rush of a stream. But his final entry was markedly different. It spoke of being watched. He wrote that at first it was only a feeling, a prickling along the back of his neck. But then he began to notice shapes moving where no one should have been. The sun was sinking low when the first real signs appeared. His boot prints, later discovered by rangers, showed him leaving the main trail, though there was no reason for him to have strayed. The soil revealed something else alongside his tracks. Prints that did not belong to shoes or boots. They were wider, elongated, toes splayed unnaturally, as though whatever followed him walked barefoot yet with strength enough to press deep into the earth. As he hurried, his camera snapped a series of blurred images, the last photographs ever recovered. The frames showed trees and undergrowth, but in the corner of one was a pale hand gripping the bark of a trunk, fingers too long, the skin mottled and raw. Another showed what looked like a face, half hidden, gaunt and twisted, with eyes glowing faintly in the dimming light. When the trail curved sharply, his steps faltered. There, the soil bore violent marks, scuffs, gouges, the drag of heels. His pack was found torn open, belongings scattered. The journal lay nearby, its final lines scrawled hurriedly, almost illegible. "They are faster than me." What happened beyond that point remained speculation, but the evidence suggested a struggle. His body was never recovered, and despite extensive searches, no trace was found deeper into the woods. What the rangers did find weeks later was a piece of fabric snagged high in the branches of a tree, far above where any man could have climbed. The locals believe he was taken, dragged from the trail at the moment when day surrendered to night. They whisper that dusk is the hour the feral ones emerge boldly, when the shadows grant them cover and the silence of the woods grows thick enough to mask their movements. To this day, hikers are warned. Never linger in the Blue Ridge as the sun dips below the horizon. If the trail begins to feel wrong, if the silence turns oppressive, leave at once. For once darkness takes hold, the forest belongs not to you, but to them. Hunters know the forest better than most. They rise before dawn, track the land with skill, and read the signs written in broken twigs and scattered prints. Yet sometimes even those who know the woods intimately vanish within them, swallowed whole by something they cannot fight. One such man was a seasoned hunter from a small town near the edge of the Blue Ridge. He had hunted those mountains for decades, and the locals said he could navigate the ridges blindfolded. But one autumn he went in and did not return. He set off with his rifle, a hunting knife, and a pack of supplies. The day was bright, the air sharp with the bite of cold. Witnesses saw him heading toward one of the lesser-traveled trails, a place where deer were said to move quietly through dense undergrowth. He promised his family he would return by evening. He never did. When search parties went looking, they found strange signs almost immediately. His footprints were steady at first, heading deep into the ridge. But as the hours passed, they became erratic, zigzagging, stopping suddenly as though he had been listening, or turning to check behind him. The men who followed the tracks noted something else as well. Prints alongside his own, bare and misshapen, always appearing, then vanishing again, as if the forest swallowed them. His pack was found hanging from a low branch, torn open, its contents scattered. The rifle lay on the ground nearby, but the barrel was bent, warped as though gripped by impossible force. Claw marks scored the tree trunks, deep gouges where bark had been ripped away. Whatever had stalked him had strength beyond anything a man could resist. Deeper still, his knife was discovered, planted into the earth as though he had thrust it down in desperation. The soil bore drag marks, long and chaotic, a trail of struggle that ended abruptly in an open clearing. There, in the center, was a circle of disturbed leaves, as though many feet had moved around it. And then nothing, no more footprints, no more trail, just silence. The strangest detail was found days later. A tattered piece of clothing, confirmed as his, dangled high from a pine branch nearly 30 feet off the ground. No hunter could have climbed so high unaided, and no storm had blown through to scatter debris. It was placed there deliberately, as though to taunt those who searched. The family never found closure, only the hunter's watch, returned by rangers who discovered it on the forest floor. Its glass face cracked and the hands frozen at the moment he must have struggled. His story became another in the growing ledger of disappearances, proof that even the most skilled and experienced are not safe. Among hunters now, the tale is told as a warning. They say the feral ones have no fear of guns or blades, and that they watch the woods closely when hunters enter. Sometimes they take not for hunger but for sport, and when they do, the hunter never comes back. In the depths of the Blue Ridge, there are old hunting cabins, some forgotten, some still standing as weather-worn skeletons among the trees. Most hikers pass them by, noting only the sagging roofs and shuttered windows, but some who dared to spend a night inside tell stories they wish they could forget. One tale in particular is told in whispers, of a small group who sought shelter in one such cabin when a storm rolled down the mountains. The evening began harmlessly enough. Rain fell in steady sheets, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the group lit lanterns to chase away the shadows. The cabin was cramped but sturdy, its logs groaning softly as the wind battered the walls. They felt safe, cocooned from the storm's fury. But when night thickened, other sounds emerged, sounds that did not belong to the weather. It began with a faint scraping, barely audible beneath the wind. At first they thought it was a branch dragged across the wooden exterior. Yet the noise returned, slower this time, deliberate, sliding across the cabin walls as though fingers were tracing the wood. When the group listened closely, their blood ran cold. It was not one sound, but many. Hands. Dozens of them. The scratching moved methodically, circling the cabin. Nails dragged across the logs, tapping now and then, as though testing the strength of the barrier. The storm outside masked much of the noise, but in the lulls between thunder, the group heard whispers, low, guttural, in a language no human tongue should shape. The words carried hunger, or perhaps amusement, and each person inside felt the weight of unseen eyes peering through the cracks in the shutters. One of them, panicked, pulled aside a curtain to peer outside. The lantern light caught movement immediately, pale hands withdrawing into the dark, long fingers curling like claws. Beyond them, figures crouched in the tree line, their silhouettes hunched, too thin, too tall. The watchers staggered back, stammering that the cabin was surrounded. The group tried to remain calm, stoking the fire higher, clutching what weapons they had. Yet the hands returned, pressing against the wood, testing, scraping harder, leaving splinters in their wake. At times, the boards seemed to bow inward, as though something far stronger than human strength pushed against them. Every minute stretched into hours, every sound magnified until the scratching felt like it was inside their skulls. At some point deep into the night, the noises stopped. Silence descended suddenly, oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The group dared not move, fearing that any sound would bring the creatures crashing through. Only when the first light of dawn crept through the slats did they risk stepping outside. What they saw chilled them further. The entire cabin was scarred, claw marks etched into every wall. The door frame gouged deeply as though something had tried to rip it apart. In the mud surrounding the cabin were countless footprints, wide and bare, pressed into the earth. The group left immediately, abandoning most of their belongings, and none ever returned to the Blue Ridge. The cabin still stands, though locals warn travelers never to stay there. Some nights, even from a distance, people claim to hear it. The faint, rhythmic scratching of hands that never stopped reaching for what was inside. There is a narrow service road that cuts through part of the Blue Ridge, barely used now except by rangers. It winds between trees, following the curve of a shallow creek, and for the most part, it lies empty. Yet on one occasion, a ranger driving that road came across something that still haunts him. A car left abandoned at the water's edge, doors hanging open, belongings scattered, and no sign of the family who had been traveling inside it. The vehicle was a modest saloon, its tires sunk into the mud as though it had skidded suddenly from the road. There were no signs of a collision, no broken glass, no blood. The engine was cold, but the interior carried the warmth of recent use, food wrappers left half open, a child's toy lying on the back seat. On the dashboard was a map with a route marked in pen, tracing a line toward a nearby campsite. The ranger called for backup, and together with others they searched the area. What they found was unsettling. Around the car were dozens of prints, not belonging to the family. The soil near the creek was churned with wide, bare footprints, overlapping and circling, as though a crowd had gathered around the vehicle. Drag marks led from the car door into the undergrowth, but the trail broke off suddenly, vanishing as though swallowed by the forest. Inside the boot, wedged beneath a blanket, they discovered a notebook. The handwriting inside was frantic, the ink smudged by water. The final entry read, "We are not alone. They followed us from the trail. We tried to drive, but they're already here. Please, if anyone finds this, don't stop. The family was never recovered, despite weeks of searching. No bodies, no further evidence. The car was eventually towed away, but the story spread quickly, and the site became infamous among locals. Drivers still report strange sensations when they pass along that service road, claiming the trees seem to close in, the shadows deeper than anywhere else. Some have even sworn they saw shapes crouched by the creek, pale figures hunched low, watching the passing cars with glimmering eyes. One ranger, years later, returned alone to the site. He stood by the creek at dusk, listening. For a long time there was only the rush of water. But then he heard it, a faint tapping, like fingers drumming against metal. When he turned, the sound stopped. The car was long gone, but in the mud behind him, fresh prints had appeared, wide and bare, as though someone had been standing just a breath away. To this day, the site remains a warning. In the Blue Ridge, even the roads are not safe. And sometimes, an abandoned car is not a mystery to solve, but a grave left open, waiting for the next story to join it. Families often come to the Blue Ridge in search of peace. Picnics by creeks, hikes beneath golden leaves, nights spent under clear skies. For one family, however, a weekend retreat turned into a nightmare so disturbing that it has been retold for years as a warning never to underestimate the forest's darker nature. They were a family of 4, a mother, father, and 2 children, who pitched their tent in a clearing not far from a main trail. At first everything seemed ordinary. They cooked over a fire, laughed together, and listened to the calls of owls in the distance. But as the night deepened, unease crept into their camp. The children complained of hearing footsteps just beyond the firelight, soft but deliberate, pacing back and forth. The parents brushed it off, blaming animals. Though their voices carried unease they tried to hide. The first real sign of danger came when their lantern flickered low, and in that dim light, the mother noticed shapes between the trees. Not animals, not deer, but figures. Stooped, pale and unmoving, as if waiting. She urged her husband to check, but when he shone his torch into the woods, the space was empty. Still, the sensation of being watched thickened the air. Hours dragged, and sleep refused to come. The forest grew unnaturally silent, every natural sound smothered. Then the scratching began. At first faint, then louder, hands dragging along the fabric of the tent. The children whimpered, clutching their parents as shadows loomed just beyond the thin barrier of cloth. Fingers pressed inward, stretching the canvas as though testing its strength. The father shouted, brandishing a hatchet, tearing open the tent flap to confront whoever or whatever was out there. The torchlight revealed nothing, only trees swaying gently. Yet the moment he turned back, a sound erupted behind him. Dozens of bare feet slapping against the soil, scattering into the dark. Something had been standing all around them. Panic surged. The family gathered what they could and fled down the trail, the children crying, the parents desperate. But the forest was alive with pursuit. Branches snapped, guttural breathing echoed, and pale figures darted at the edges of their light. At one point, the youngest child stumbled, and the mother swore she saw a long, clawed hand reaching from the dark before she snatched her child away. By some miracle, they burst onto the main road where another group of campers found them, hysterical and shaking. Their belongings were later recovered from the abandoned campsite, torn, shredded, scattered. The tent bore claw marks, deep gouges as though made by more than human strength. The family never returned to the mountains. They spoke little of what happened, only repeating one detail to those who asked. It had not been one creature stalking them that night, but many. Eyes glowed in every direction, and the scratching never stopped until they escaped. The story remains one of the most terrifying accounts tied to the Blue Ridge, not because of what was seen, but because of what was heard. The chorus of hands dragging across the thin walls of a tent, a sound that still keeps campers awake at night, waiting, listening, praying it does not begin for them. By now the Blue Ridge is littered with tales. Vanished hikers, abandoned camps, clawed cabins, but one story chills more than the rest. It comes not from fragments or secondhand whispers, but from a man who survived. His testimony is the closest glimpse we have of what happens when the feral ones step fully into the open, no longer content to watch from the edges of the dark. He was a ranger, seasoned and steady, accustomed to the dangers of the wild. He spoke of patrolling a section of the ridge one late autumn evening, long after most visitors had gone. The air was unnervingly still, the silence thick, but he pressed on until he reached a clearing where the remains of a campfire smoldered faintly. Around it lay scraps of belongings, an overturned mug, a blanket, a shoe without its pair. But no people. He crouched to examine the ground, and that was when he noticed them. Dozens of prints circling the fire, pressed deep into the mud. Bare feet, wide and twisted, as though belonging to people long stripped of shoes and civility. The prints overlapped in chaotic patterns, and some were fresh, damp with moisture. That meant they had been made recently. Before he could retreat, he heard it, the rustle of movement at the tree line, followed by a low, guttural hiss. Shapes emerged from the shadows, pale figures crawling forward on all fours before rising, crooked and unsteady, into the fire's glow. Their eyes caught the light, reflecting it back like those of animals. Yet their bodies were disturbingly human, gaunt and elongated. The ranger froze, knowing flight would trigger pursuit. He counted at least 7 of them, circling slowly, their movements deliberate. They sniffed the air, their chests rising and falling with sharp, animal-like breaths. One tilted its head, emitting a sound halfway between a growl and a laugh. Another reached forward, its hand dragging along the earth, fingers long and calloused from clawing bark and stone. The creatures inched closer, and the ranger understood then that he was prey. Desperation lent him courage. He flung a burning branch from the fire at the nearest figure. The flame burst against its chest, and though it shrieked in rage, it did not fall. The others hissed in unison, recoiling briefly, but their circle held. With no other choice, the ranger backed slowly, step by step, until his hand brushed the butt of his pistol. He fired once into the air. The sound cracked through the clearing like thunder, and the creatures scattered, melting into the trees with unnatural speed. Yet he swore the echo of their laughter lingered long after, mocking him. He never returned to that clearing. When he told his story, his voice trembled, not from shame, but from the knowledge of what he had seen too clearly. The feral ones were not shadows or legends. They were real, and they had come far too close. His warning still hangs heavy over the Blue Ridge. They are watching always, waiting always. If the firelight dims and the woods grow silent, you will not have long. When they decide to step closer, you will understand the truth too late. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part of all, that the Blue Ridge does not merely hold stories. It holds eyes in the dark, claws on the trees, and hands that reach for anyone who dares linger too long. The tales are not warnings. They are promises.